Everyone. The Unitarian Universalist Association office at the United Nations has for many years, since 2008, had at least one of our workshops at CSW to deal with sexual orientation, gender identity issues. And this is the event you are at today. Let me introduce our first speaker, Sameena Azhar, MPH, MSW, PhD, has 18 years of clinical and research experience in the fields of mental health, substance abuse, and HIV. She has also worked for several years as a behavioral intervention trainer for the California STD HIV Prevention Training Center, housed at the STD control branch of the California Department of Public Health, and as a clinical social worker for Ward 86, the HIV clinic at San Francisco General Hospital. Sameena has lived and worked in the Bronx, Los Angeles, Oakland, San Francisco, Delhi, Philadelphia, Hyderabad, Chicago, and now Harlem. She is currently engaged in 3 major research projects. One, she is conducting an examination of Guru Chala, the culture of Kawashira, and I'm mispronouncing it. Anyway, the 3rd gender of Mingora, Swat, Pakistan. With 3 other Asian American female social work researchers, Sameena is beginning a project examining how anti-Asian racism impacts the mental health of Asian American populations in the United States through the COVID-19 pandemic. With 4 other researchers at the Graduate School of Social Service, she is leading a project examining public attitudes in New York City regarding the radicalization of COVID-19 stigma. She is currently serving on Fordham's Faculty Senate Salary and Benefits Committee and the President's Human Resources Considerations Task Force for the reopening of Fordham. Sameena plays jazz, piano, and grows orchids. Please welcome Sameena.
My goodness, that's like my entire biography. Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us so early in the morning, and thank you for the invitation from Unitarian Universalist Association. I wanted to make sure I got that right, at the United Nations. I'm really happy to be here. So I'm going to be talking today about a community of 3rd gender people in South Asia that are known by several different names. I'm just going to switch over to sharing my screen here. Oops. Oh, of course, now it's going to give me problems. Sorry. Okay. Hopefully this is, am I good now? Yeah? Okay. So I'm going to be talking about a community of 3rd gender people in South Asia that are probably most popularly known as Hijra. So that word is H-I-J-R-A, Hijra. It's an Arabic word that means migration. It's used to refer to the migration historically that Muhammad made from Mecca to Medina. So it's a route that is recreated through the pilgrimage to Hajj. But it's a word that's also associated with migration in general. So Hijra have been historically a nomadic community that have traveled between different parts of India, Pakistan, Nepal, Bangladesh, and are, I think, uniquely socially constructed in the South Asian context, which is a non-binary formation of gender, right? And the community has historically also been associated with spirituality. So I think there are different reasons for this. Hindu conceptions of divinity are often androgynous, or encapsulate both masculine and feminine qualities at once. So because of their androgyny, Hijra were seen to be closer to God and seen to be blessed with powers to be able to curse folks, to bless people. They're often called upon at weddings and childbirths to bless the bride and groom, to bless the newborn child. So they're seen to have these very auspicious powers. In Pakistan and in northern India as well, this group is known as Khwaja Sira. So Khwaja Sira is a word or a phrase that is derived from Farsi. So there's several different ways to refer to gender nonconforming people in South Asia, including words like kustra, kenar, koti. There's a whole slew of different identities depending on language and region. I'm just gonna later put into the chat this link to a video that I think may be helpful introducing folks to what this, how this community is socially constructed in South Asia, and some of the obstacles that they face. I won't have time to show that here, but I'll share that along with all of you later. So let me get to what work I've been doing with this community. I started off working in South India, which is where I'm from, in Hyderabad, and I received an email actually from a doctoral student, graduate student, he's a master's student, who's here today, Imtiaz Ahmed, and who wanted basically assistance in being able to carry out his master's thesis project. And we started collaborating, and this really bloomed into a much bigger research project, which is what I'm presenting here today. So what I'm going to focus on today is how the work of Khwaja Sira communities, particularly in Mingora, Swat, Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, Pakistan, I'll tell you exactly where that is, have been impacted by the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic. So because of this sort of bestowed spirituality on the community, they often in the past had occupied state-sanctioned roles as courtesans, as handmaidens, as advisors during Mughal times. With the coming of British colonialism, that means of state-sanctioned support was lost because the very identity of being a hijra or a Khwaja Sira became criminalized. So through the 1871 Criminal Tribes Act and the Dramatic Performance Act, it became a crime to cross-dress, to publicly perform song and dance. So many of the things that the community did as a means of livelihood became criminalized. Following colonialism. So after that time, it became much more popular as a means of livelihood, or much more common, I should say, as a means of livelihood for Hijra and Khwaja Sira to engage in sex work and panhandling. So they will often ask for donations at perhaps a train station or a market, and engage in this sort of very distinctive clapping that sort of announces their presence. They have a secret language, and in South India, this is called Ulti, which means backwards. Similarly, in Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, there is a secret language that is spoken amongst the community, also very much derived from Farsi, but a means for folks to be able to communicate key messages to each other in public. So if there was a danger of safety or a threat to their safety that was occurring, they could speak to each other without folks around them knowing what was being said. So it's a very sort of protective and inclusive means of keeping the community somewhat insulated and safe. So we looked at really how their work had been impacted through the pandemic. So just to situate you in where we are, we're looking at this kind of border region between Afghanistan and Pakistan. You'll see it's called the Northwest Frontier. That's actually a colonial term as well. It's now KP or Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, right? You see Mingora there in the Swat Valley. So this is a Pashtun speaking region for the most part. I'm fluent in Urdu, which is the national language of Pakistan, but not in Pashto. So my research assistants really conducted all of the interviewing, Imtiaz in particular, going to all kinds of locations to be able to reach out to folks that we were trying to get in the study. So we conducted 45 interviews with Khwaja Sira on their experiences during the pandemic. Eligibility criteria were that they identify as a Khwaja Sira, they reside in Mingora, that they speak Pashto, and that they were over the age of 18. We collected these interviews between 2019 and 2021. Some people were actually interviewed multiple times. When we started the study, the pandemic had not begun. So there was a sort of shift in focus post-pandemic. And also there was a delay in when India and Pakistan or South Asia at large were impacted by the pandemic. So sort of that gave us a bit of a cushion to collect some data beforehand. We organized this interview guide around the themes of Guru Chela culture. So I'll just explain briefly that means this kind of master and apprentice culture of learning from a more senior member of the Khwaja Sira community. It's quite similar in many ways to ballroom culture, if you're familiar with that, here in New York City. So this kind of idea of being taken in by a house mother who shows you the ways of being a Khwaja Sira, who helps you to be able to learn a trade, right, to be able to earn a livelihood. And as we found in many of the interviews, can also lead to certain relationships that may be exploitive. So I'll get into that in a bit. We collected data from 6 major deras. Deras are basically communal living dwellings. They're known in India more often as havelis or gharanas, but basically places where people live together in a larger group, right? So selecting folks from each of the 6 major deras. In KP, we recorded the interviews, translated them into sometimes Urdu, but most often directly into English, and then analyzed the transcripts for themes. So what we found, and this is still, it's sort of early on in our analysis. So this is kind of an iterative process. And I'd love to hear your thoughts on how we're beginning to organize these themes. But generally, the 2 overarching themes were in regard to financial insecurity, and secondly, in regard to social vulnerability. So there's some sub-themes there, which I'll go into in more detail now. So first, in financial insecurity, really a loss of income and financial stress, because so much of their livelihood was coming from making public dance performances or performances at weddings. Much of that revenue was completely lost because there were no, large gatherings being held or public parties being had. So a lot of stress coming from the fact that folks really had lost that major source of livelihood. So even more then had to rely on engagement in sex work. Right. So let me just read one of these quotes here. Because of the fear of COVID-19, our clients don't come for our services. Our Markan or long-term partners, Ashikan, lovers and Tamashbin or spectators, stop seeing us. They're worried about their health and safety. They think they can easily get infected from Khwaja Sira because of the Mulvis or the religious leaders' negative propaganda against us. They think we are the cause of this disease. If we take risks and wish to engage in sex work, we can't do it like we did in normal times. The people who come and receive our sexual services are paying only 100 to 200 rupees, which is very little. And we Khwaja Sira engage with these customers because we need the money. So this level of precarity working in sex work that was already there pre-pandemic really gets escalated because it becomes really the sole means of income for folks. So there's some more examples of that. I won't read all of these, but just to give you a sort of flavor for how an already vulnerable profession becomes even more vulnerable through the pandemic. And so many of our respondents reported wanting to have some sort of alternative livelihood, wanting to engage in occupation outside of sex work and not having the means to do so because many of them had basically been ousted from school at a very young age. So most folks had less than a sort of high school level of education. So wanting to develop some alternative profession or trade repeatedly came up in interviews, and is really part of where our next steps working with the community will be. Not to say also I'm absolutely pro sex work, so our incentive was not to try to get people out of a particular trade, but because they themselves vocalized that they wanted to do other things and were not able to feel as safe as they wanted to feel during the pandemic, this has become more of a point of interest. So social vulnerability. We noticed, as was the case, I think, really globally, right, that everybody felt much more isolated through the pandemic. So spending more time by themselves, already being an ostracized community or marginalized community, again, becomes escalated. And then knowing that if they did not put themselves in situations that would put them at higher risk for COVID, they wouldn't have a means to eat, right? So there's continuous tension between work and safety. So, for example, I'll read, COVID-19 has pushed us into extreme isolation because most people, and particularly religious-minded people, spread negative propaganda against the Quajasra community. Mulvi say that COVID-19 is God's wrath and punishment because human beings are more obscene now. And when a nation or mankind is obscene, God's wrath descends on them. And COVID-19 is a consequence of that immorality. So much of the same type of messages that were received towards this community in regard to HIV are recreated here with COVID. So recognizing that Mulvis or religious leaders in this area have been so instrumental in shaping public views. Again, the next part of our project will be focusing on working more closely with them to help kind of hopefully morph some of the public opinion on the community. So psychological distress, witnessing repeat instances of death and not feeling like there was a means to prevent those deaths, right? So we saw and experienced the death rates for Quajasra increasing day by day. In this COVID-19 era, that takes our sleep. I think and feel my death is so near to me because I can't survive these harsh situations. We noticed also that, again, issues that existed pre-pandemic were escalated. So before the pandemic, Quajasra have a hard time being able to have a formal funeral ceremony or burial. The way that Muslim burials typically take place is that there's a washing of the body that takes place in a gender segregated area. So because they don't fit into the binary of men or women, they are often not afforded the option to be able to receive that ghusl, or the sort of washing of the body that takes place in a masjid prior to burial. So the sort of decency of a death also being prohibited to the community, right? When they would try to access medical care for COVID as well, their treatment was not prioritized, right? So if there were only a limited number of beds, it was unlikely that they would get one of those limited beds. So you see in this first quote, 2 weeks ago, one of our fellow Quajasra became ill and died, and we couldn't support him financially. Because of this COVID, we are empty. We don't have any money. She was a TB patient. For the last 2 years, the Quajasra Swat collected money for her treatment and medicine, and she was living on that. But now during this lockdown, doctors at the government hospital wouldn't admit her. Her doctors argued that we have plenty of COVID-infected patients and we don't have any space. We couldn't send her outside of Swat, and we lost a Quajasra's life. So a few stories similar to that, and not being able to get a bed at a hospital or come up with the money that was needed for private treatment elsewhere. As I said, that the next part of our research is really trying to work more closely with religious leaders. We're working with a couple of NGOs in the Swat region, and hoping to conduct some focus groups with Quajasra in the fall as well. Really the overarching goal with this future work is to try to slowly shift some of the public sentiments or attitudes regarding gender nonconformity, particularly in this part of Pakistan, which is often viewed to be the most religiously conservative region. So thank you, and I look forward to your comments and questions.
Thank you very much, Sameena. That was so interesting. And I think I have many, many questions, but I'll try to think of one particular one to start with. I was kind of wondering about this. I know they live in communities together, but do they have any contact with their original families? Are they totally ostracized from their own families? That was like one thought. And then the other thought was like I know at the end you said you're working with mullahs and stuff. So there's absolutely no government support for communities like this either. I mean, I know in India, like there's lots of things they try to do with the Dalit communities and stuff like that. But in like with hijras, I don't know how the government sees them if they're part of like something that there's more support for.
Yeah, I mean, interestingly, throughout South Asia, all countries except for Sri Lanka officially recognize the third gender, right? So you can have this third gender identity status in E instead of an M or an F on your national identity card, on your passport. So at least legally, that's the case, you know, across these countries. I think in practice, it varies. KP was actually the first province throughout South Asia, India included, to adopt a transgender rights policy. So there is a Transgender Persons Protection Act in both India and Pakistan. The language of these can be somewhat misleading because some of the things are actually stigmatizing, but are written in at least the name of protecting trans communities, right? So I think there is, on the legal level or on the books, a sort of support, but a lot of the work that is being done locally tends to be through NGOs, and through the aid also of international development organizations that are funding those projects regionally. I forgot what your first question was.
It was more just like, especially at times of COVID, did they have any contact with their, like, their families of origin? I mean,
that's a great question. So, I mean, even before COVID, many folks had basically run away from home or been kicked out of their homes at a pretty young age for not conforming to the sort of typically masculine gender identity, right? And so some folks, interestingly, even though they didn't have continued social support with their family, would still send money back because they would have quite high incomes as sex workers, some of them at least. And so would continue to send money home to their folks who they never engaged with otherwise, really. So I found that really interesting, that the financial connection remained even though you know, some of the social ties were lost. I think once the lockdown occurred, stay-at-home orders, it's popularly called a lockdown in South Asia, so I'm saying that because that's how people refer to it there. It became very difficult to travel within either India or Pakistan, right? So all of the buses and trains and whatnot had been canceled, right, or shut down. So folks got basically stuck in places. So we heard stories like this in our interviews as well, where people wanted to go home, but the cost of private transportation to be able to get home, because public transportation was no longer available, was too expensive. One person in particular, very interestingly, actually decided to no longer be a cross-dresser and like gave up their identity to be able to go back home. So that was like a precondition for them to return home, was to no longer be queer, basically.
I would like to ask one question. Actually, I'm not supposed to, but I'm going to do it anyway, and then move on to our next speaker. When particularly Westerners, when we hear the term third gender, we often think of gender nonconformity, which is becoming more accepted here in the West. We actually have a member of the UUA staff who identifies as non-binary, and actually he gave a speech at one of our previous seminars, and he says, sometimes I wake up and I want to be a woman and I'll dress as a woman, and the next day I'll wake up and I want to be a man and I'll dress as a man. That doesn't seem to be allowed in Iran, Pakistan, or India. If you choose this lifestyle, you basically must always appear as a woman, or am I mistaken?
I think it's mixed. So in my work in South India, it was very common actually for folks who identified as Hijra to also be married to a cisgender woman and have children with that woman as well, and raise a family together with her. So some of those folks would say, yeah, I'm a man by day and I'm a woman at night, or a Hijra at night. And the night and day distinctions of gender identity are also, I think, really interesting, like where it is or is not sanctioned. So I think you're right. Historically, the communities were, the identity was all encompassing, right? So if you were a Hijra, you were always a Hijra, or always a Khwaja. But I think, again, because of the loss of this sort of ability to be part of this community in a way that is also financially secure is no longer there. So I think partially because of that, and partially I think because pressures, I mean, gosh, I've experienced this, pressures within South Asian culture to conform to, being married and having children are intense. So so folks may sort of want to have their cake and eat it too.
Well, thank you very much. Really fascinating topic. I'm sure there'll be more questions later, but we shall move along. Our next speaker is Dr. Laura Kiros, PhD, LMSW, advises, coaches, and trains boards of directors, executives, and other professionals across the corporate professional services, higher education, and nonprofit sectors to advise their DEI efforts. Dr. Quiros has served as an associate professor of social work at Adelphi University, where she teaches social work at the doctoral and master's levels. Her research and scholarly interests focus on the social construction of racial and ethnic identity and trauma-informed care through a social justice lens. And Dr. Karos also serves as the director of Adelphi University's External Diversity Certificate Program offered through the College of Professional and Continuing Studies. She was awarded the Adelphi University 2021 Award for Excellence in Teaching Social Justice, Equity, Diversity, Inclusion. As a woman of color from a multicultural background, Dr. Karos leverages her experiences, relationship building, and clinical skills to foster connections, inclusion, and empathetic accountability. Having to negotiate her own identity required her to create safe spaces to survive and thrive, and helped her develop tools to allow her to relate to various experiences that impact diverse groups. Dr. Quiros earned a doctorate in philosophy and social work, the Graduate School of University Center of the City University of New York, where her dissertation focused on the social construction of racial and ethnic identity among women of color from mixed ancestry, psychological freedoms, and sociology. She also earned a master's degree in social work from Hunter College School of Social Work and a bachelor's degree in psychology from Skidmore College. Dr. Quiros' latest book focuses on incorporating diversity and inclusion into trauma-informed social work. Please welcome Dr. Laura Kiros.
Thank you so much. Those bios are so cumbersome. I'm able to hold space with all of you today. And Sameena, thank you for that. I learned a lot from your presentation and just further enforced the vulnerabilities and the trauma that many populations have experienced forever, and particularly in the last 2 years. So, you know, my name is Laura Kiros, as Bruce shared with all of you. My pronouns are she, her. I have ancestry in Puerto Rico and Venezuela. I identify as a Black Latina, and my mom was also white and Jewish. So my identity is very holistic, and I live in the space of intersectionality. And so this morning, I'm going to really talk to you about trauma, and I'm going to contextualize that because for me, my work lives in the space of creating inclusive spaces. And so we're going to talk about how we all have a responsibility to lean into trauma-informed organizational culture and create healing justice spaces. And I think this is particularly relevant now because of all that we've been through. I don't think anyone here in the panel or in the audience can say that we haven't been through some sort of trauma. And those of us with already marginalized identities have experienced that so much more. I mean, Sameena, you named financial stress, social vulnerability as themes in your research. And I would even say that those are themes that all of us have experienced because of COVID. And so now how can we look at trauma through the lens of it being socio-political trauma, which I will unpack for you in a minute, and think about ways that we can hold space together where we can have communities of healing so people can actually bring their sincere selves to their lives. And so that's where we are today. And so I'm going to share also a brief PowerPoint with you. And I know we don't have a ton of time today, but I'd like to sort of walk us through what I mean by this. And so the beginning of this is what I'm really calling is challenging dominant trauma narratives. And so my work really lives in the space of what I call positive disruption. And what I mean by that is that disrupting status quo spaces through the lens of compassion and love. You know, a lot of my work is in the space of diversity, equity, inclusion, and social justice, but I believe that that is a calling in and it is an invitation. And it has to be grounded in love and compassion and what I call empathic accountability, which I'll also explain to you, because if it's not, then people aren't going to stay at the table, then people aren't going to come. And, you know, I was thinking a lot about sort of my role on this panel today, and I do a lot of trainings on what implicit bias is and what allyship is. And as a cisgender woman in this space today, I see myself in that place of privilege from that sexual orientation and understanding how do we show up for communities and for groups, even when the issue doesn't affect us personally. And that's about solidarity. And so as we move through this, I'd like for us to really begin with a land acknowledgement. My work is in the field of trauma. And so I believe that a lot of trauma has experienced erasure. And so really understanding from the very beginning, where are you calling in from, right? So presently I am in Montclair, New Jersey, which is the land of the Lenape. And without our indigenous nations, we wouldn't be here today. So from the very beginning, from a very intentional place, how do we acknowledge the communities that have created the space where we can be and name them? Right? Instead of just erasing that history and erasing that culture, because there is intergenerational trauma if we don't do that. And so when I talk about trauma, and I define that, and I'd like for you to think for a minute when I say trauma, you know, what is the definition that comes up for you? And so trauma for me is the experience of being overwhelmed. It's the experience of an event happening that is completely unpredictable, that overwhelms our experience to cope. And as we all sat through COVID-19 in our various locations, through our various positionalities, we all experience an overwhelming amount of stress and an overwhelming amount of feelings in order for us to be able to cope. So when we talk about trauma, we're talking about a reaction to a kind of wound, right? Trauma is a kind of wound. And traditionally in the space of traditional psychology. It has been wedded to diagnostic categories that don't actually talk about the experiences, the daily experiences of working class women, people of color, LGBTQ plus communities, immigrants, those with disabilities, and I could go on. Trauma is usually from the lens of just an interpersonal space, but doesn't intersect with the socio-political trauma, right? And so when I was doing my work, I started as a clinician way back in the 90s in a traditional therapeutic community with men and women and people who had were there as an alternative to incarceration. And I was sitting, those of us who are clinicians and social workers in this space sit in these very, brave and safe spaces, one-on-one or group work. But when those people go back to their communities, as Sameena shared in her research, when those individuals go back to those organizations, if they're in residential treatment programs, there is the opportunity that they will be re-traumatized because of socio-political trauma, because the organization is trauma, right, is filled with trauma. And so how do we really look at, okay, it's wonderful to be able to create that brave, safe space with people, but then also how do we work with the organization? How do we also bring those safe and brave spaces to the organization so that the organization can also become trauma informed, and not just trauma informed from a white cisgendered male lens, but trauma informed from the lens of diversity. Because that is also the thing that I found in the space of traditional trauma practice, is that a lot of trauma was based, a lot of the trauma literature, a lot of trauma theories were based on well-educated cisgender white middle-class women and men. And so inadvertently, it neglected the diversity in the experiences and the situations by class, race, gender, sexuality, immigration status. And it stopped there. And so, a lot of my work, as I shared with you my identity in the beginning, I did that very intentionally because as I was, growing up in the worlds of sort of racism and anti-Semitism and really trying to figure out who I was, and I turned to the literature, there was nothing there that spoke to my experience, right? And so how do we as NGOs, how do we as educators, as students, as professionals really think about the ways in which we may be inherently exclusive because of the way that the literature is defined. And so when we talk about trauma-informed practice from a social justice lens, we are talking about that you are actively working towards creating spaces of social justice. We are talking about the fact that you consider the historical history as part of the traumatic load. I started intentionally with a land acknowledgement because there is intergenerational trauma, historical trauma in Indigenous nations that we don't recognize. And if we're not naming that trauma, if we're not putting that trauma front and center, it gets erased, right? And then we understand as practitioners, as leaders, as educators, that those systems of oppression and that historical trauma lives in the body. It's manifested in the body. And so I tell my students all the time, yes, it's fine to meet with a client and talk about what's going on with them individually, but are you also connecting those diagnoses? Are you also connecting those physical manifestations, those what's happening psychologically with those people to systemic systems of oppression? Because if you're not, you're just looking at the individual through a deficit lens. And so to be trauma informed means you have examined, right? Means you are continually examining race, racism, gender, and ultimately white supremacy, right? You are disrupting that in order to actually hold space for people that fit outside of sort of this dominant culture that we are so used to. And so one of the things, and again, we don't have a lot of time today, but I hope you are sitting there with your notes and your notebooks and your computers or your phones and thinking about how do you define trauma? When trauma comes up for you, are you also thinking about not just interpersonal trauma, but are you also thinking about socio-political trauma? I would say that, as a person of color in a predominantly white institution or a predominantly white organization, I experienced trauma. And can we name that? And if we don't name that, then again, it goes erased. So are you thinking about your organizations and the ways in which you work where there has been trauma, particularly over the past 2 years, right? I think we have an opportunity now. We've never been in this space before, right? to really interrogate the ways in which we are creating organizational culture from a trauma-informed lens, so that populations like Sameena spoke about can have a sense of freedom of self. And so what factors, when you think about trauma, impact your ability to recognize trauma? I do a lot of work with organizations on the process of socialization. So we've all been socialized in our life. We're socialized in our homes, in our family of origins, in our communities. And those ways that we've been socialized really speak to our worldview. But if our worldview remains very limited and we're not looking outside of the ways that we've been socialized, we're only operating from a myopic place, right? So are we able to sit in the space of sort of opening up and understanding that the way that we've been engaging with the world may just be one small part? And that takes quiet moments of accountability where you are sitting yourself and understanding how you've been complicit probably in the oppression of marginalized groups without even knowing it. And so I talk about the difference between intention and impact, that, you know, in this space, all of us sitting here have good intention. Our field is grounded in good intention, but does that intention match our impact? And when it doesn't match our impact, are we able to say, wait a minute, you know, I forgot to add my pronouns. I didn't recognize that I skipped over that person. I am working in a building where there isn't a ramp for somebody that can use sort of a wheelchair in that space, right? And so with that, what I really hope, and I mean this because I think for me, my work is an embodiment that it's not only what I do, but it's who I am. And so when I think about sincere inclusion, I think about the practice of holding each other empathically accountable, accountability through the lens of empathy. And so that is an act and an embodiment of caring for another that extends beyond ourselves into our workspaces, our homes, and our communities. And so, you know, I have always thought that accountability sort of gets a bad rap because I think as we live in this sort of cancel culture, there's a lot of fear about when people aren't doing things well or when somebody gets called in or, as we could say, called out. But I think about accountability as the people that love me the most hold me the most accountable. Right? And so how do we create NGOs? How do we create organizations where we can begin to hold each other accountable through the lens of empathy? Because we only have a limited view, right? I only know my world. I educate myself on the world of others, and I build relationships with those who occupy different positionalities and identities as I do. But I am going to mess up. I am going to misstep. I'm going to misname. I'm going to misgender. I am going to do things because I am only limited in my capacity, right? I am human, I am fallible. And so I need my community to hold me accountable. I need my community to say, Laura, you know, you missed that, or when you said that, it didn't land right. And so I hope that we all strive to be in spaces of empathic accountability, where we operate from the place of good intention, but also understand how our impact can land wrong, and where we can learn to take care of ourselves and our community. And so I really want to move into what I'm calling healing justice. And so, you know, what I've been thinking about a lot lately is how do we really begin to heal? I don't know if those of you are familiar with the term radical self-care, but I'm talking about self-care and I'm talking about healing beyond just sort of everyday practices, right? That most of us live in spaces of cognition, right? We sit in spaces of dialogue, which can be incredibly healing, but how are we also looking to other ways, right? How are we also looking to Eastern practices of healing? How are we also understand, including healing justice in our NGOs, in our organizations, in our academies, so that it becomes normative practice, right? And if we saw accountability as a way to better ourselves and each other, I really think that healing justice would be more natural. And so, you know, I think for myself, I'll use myself as an example that, you know, the places of healing for me extend beyond just through process, right, or individual therapy. It extends to spaces of meditation. It extends to long walks. It extends to spending time with my community and my family and my children. And so how are we incorporating healing justice and sort of not thinking of self-care as an add-on, but as something that is fundamental to organizational culture, that is fundamental to creating organizational cultures that are trauma-informed through the lens of social justice. And I think I'm sort of like a broken record, but if there was ever a time to do this, it is right now, because we have just been through and are still in a world that is very new for all of us, right? And has hit populations and demographics of people who have been traditionally marginalized in ways that we don't even know. And so I just really, I'm going to stop sharing my screen because I want to really just pause for a minute and see if there are any questions. And I asked Rose to put in the chat. I wrote a book on trauma-informed practice from a social justice lens. And from that book, I developed a definition. So Rose put that definition in the chat for people to have. And so I really just want to pause here and thank you and hope that I gave you questions and things to think about and really sort of leave with this embodiment of trauma-informed practice from a social justice lens and the responsibility of that for all of us based on where we are and our locus of control.
Doctor, I do have a question. First, thank you for challenging us to examine our bias, our privilege. You know, disclosure is hard and sometimes even deadly. We actually had a speaker drop out because it was going to be recorded, and if it got back to her home country, there would be dire consequences. So how do we work towards like a trauma-informed and social justice system of care? How do we create that psychological safety?
Thank you for that question. And yeah, I realize that a speaker did drop out and that's not okay, right? We should all feel that, right? We should all feel that. And my first answer to that, Rose, is little by little, like little by little, because yes, disclosure is deadly. It can be deadly. And so I think part of building trauma-informed systems of care is first understanding what that means for an organization. So I do a lot of work. I go to organizations, I go to executive teams, and I look at their mission and I say, okay, let's take this mission. How is this mission trauma-informed? How is this mission truly driven by social justice, not just performative? Because in a lot of nonprofit, NGO spaces, you hear words like empowerment. And to me, I'm like, unpack that. What is empowerment? Is it from sort of a hierarchy, colonial empowerment, or is empowerment from the place of collaboration, where I am working with you in that space to give voice to whatever needs to be given voice to? And I think we've done not such a great job of naming and living in the space of rhetoric from a hierarchy, from a place of hierarchy, and not through the place of collaboration, not through the place of trustworthiness, not through the place of psychological safety. And so it's first really unpacking what is the foundation of the organization and where are challenges in this and where are our strengths in this? And then moving on from there through trainings, through dialogues, through care, little by little, all grounded in compassion and love, because that's really what's going to move us.
Thank you so much. I think I wish you could say this to everybody every day until it sinks in, because this really is a way of living that I think we all need. And I really appreciate your message. And again, I don't think you can give this message often enough to enough people, because what you're challenging us to do is not easy. It's changing behavior, changing the way we do things, and having somebody like you to remind us. And I love your idea of compassionate, empathetic accountability, when you have people around you that will hold you accountable, you make those small changes in your behavior, and you get to where you need to go. And I really appreciate everything you've said. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
I do want to move on to our final speaker because time is short. So Ezgi Ulusoy Yılmaz was born in Izmir, Turkey. She graduated from Istanbul University, Department of English, Interpreting and Translation. She holds a master's degree from Istanbul Bilgi University, Department of International Relations and Political Science. She contributed to translation of book collections, and her first translated work, entitled Coffee, A Dark History, was published by MB Publishing Publications in 2009. She also partook in a narration and editing team of a series of business guides during her position in DEIK. She also worked in Migration Research Center in Istanbul Bilgi University between 2006 2008, and partook in the projects Organic Village and Children's Village and Foundation for Protecting Children in Need between 2018 and 2021. She is a founding board member of Orange Association Working for Gender Equality and founding board member of Scoop Izmir Development Social Cooperative, one of the leading social cooperatives in Turkey. Working for a social benefit, Ms. Ezgi is working as an executive and Agri-Trade Term Incorporated, operating in eligible in trading, and she is married with four-year-old twins. Sorry for the mispronunciations. And Ezgi, I think, is joining us from Turkey, so I really appreciate you dealing with time differences and joining us from so far away. Thank you very much for being here. Please, everybody, welcome Ezgi.
Hello, everyone. Greetings from Turkey. Today, I would like to tell briefly about Turuncu's story, Turuncu Association story, starting with a short outlook to Turkey's gender equality status. Then I will talk about how we started, what and how we do. Turkey is still suffering deeply from gender inequality and all types of gender-based violence. In 2021, 418 women were killed by partners or relatives. 15% of girl children under age of 18 are married. 1 out of 4 women is experiencing at least one type of violence throughout her life. This rate is much higher among LGBTIQ people. Every year, social exclusion and discrimination drive many young LGBTIQ people to consider committing suicide. According to a research by Kadir Has University in Turkey, 54% of the total society doesn't want to be a neighbor to LGBTI people. The companies do not prefer to hire trans and LGBTI people, and if they are hired, they have to face intensive mobbing and even transphobia and homophobia, hate speech by the superiors or colleagues. Another research by the same university reveals that difficulty for finding a job and concern for the future is more severe among LGBTIQ people. Participants pointed to issues like exclusion, negative feelings including anger, loss of hope from life and future, affecting general motivation at work and decreasing the efficiency. Another finding is that 1 out of 2 LGBTIQ employees experienced gender-based discrimination, or they didn't experience it because they were assumed to be non-trans or heterosexual, since they didn't disclose their gender identity, sexual orientation, or sex characteristics. No matter how much they are exposed to discrimination and hate speech, they are also unable to seek justice through legal or executive channels. Let alone working, living in Turkey is extremely difficult for LGBTIQ+ people. Unfortunately, Turkey ranks first in Europe and ninth in the world in terms of transgender murders. In other words, gender-based violence still continues to damage well-being, health, dignity, and security of women, children, and LGBTIQ people. Yet it remains hidden in Turkey, which is a culture of silence, full of taboos. In 2017, we, a group of people who cannot be indifferent to those facts, mostly working in the same company, attempted to adopt United Nations Orange the World campaign to Izmir, where we all live. Orange Izmir campaign started along with the UN 16th day of activism and turned out to be a large campaign in a short span of time. This was a great success and has encouraged us to pursue our aims with bigger enthusiasm and ambition in a more organized way. That is how we have decided to establish Turuncu, the Orange Association, with the leadership of Ms. Ulusoy Castelli, who has successfully run several social responsibility projects, both personally and as the chairperson of Izmir Commodity Exchange. We aim to promote and support all efforts to fight gender-based inequalities and gender-based violence, particularly against vulnerable groups, including but not limited to women, children, the LGBTQI, and refugees. We are aware that our task is tough because Turuncu is not an NGO for women only, for many others in Turkey, but adopts a more comprehensive approach towards gender inequalities and struggles against gender-based discrimination, hate speech, transphobia, and homophobia. Our mainstay is equality and basic human rights. As Universal Declaration of Human Rights, Article 1 says, all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. They are endowed with reason and conscience and should act towards one another in spirit of brotherhood. That is why we shall never forget caring for one's fellow human being. Let me briefly speak about what we do and how we do. Orange Izmir campaign has gained considerable support in a short period of time and has become a routine to be held every year with the great participation of individuals, local corporates, and organizations. Orange Talks is a conference series where speakers of experts, academics, and public figures speak about the issues ranging from gender inequality, the situation of refugee women, raising awareness of gender equality among children, discrimination against trans people, domestic abuse, and masculinity. The common aspects of the talks are that they motivate the audience for empathy, and they have the aspect of solution seeking. One of the most unforgettable and striking talks was given by a trans woman from Iran seeking asylum. She told her story in Iran, how she was forced to leave her beloved country for a human life. Then she talked about her life in Turkey waiting for a reply from the UN for her next stop. She is both mechanical engineer and textile engineer, but the only job she could find in Turkey was dishwashing in a bakery shop. This was short-lived, though. At the end of her speech, she asked the question, where does all this hate come from towards the people who are different? Fortunately, she supported our activities in Turuncu as a volunteer, and she taught us a lot of things. Her experiences with those of other LGBTQI people in Turkey have helped us to reshape our gender equality seminars called Orange Workshops, organized for private and public sectors to establish gender equality. We believe that corporate policies for gender equality play a key role in workplaces to prevent gender-based discrimination. We give seminars to all employees, work closely with the employers and executives to establish corporate policies, give way to a workplace where all employees are equal, protected, and feeling comfortable. Recently, Turuncu Association has signed partnership protocols and involved with some of the municipalities, both in Izmir and Istanbul, aiming at working jointly to implement sustainable inclusive projects focusing on gender equality and fighting against gender-based discrimination. With these partnerships, we will raise awareness about inequality arising from gender roles, support and empower women and LGBTQI in the workplace, in private life, with measures to prevent gender-based violence. We believe that social and cultural norms and stereotypes form mindsets, and mindsets reflect in the language and behaviors. Therefore, it all starts with challenging cultural norms, language, attitudes, and behaviors. This can only be achieved through sustainable awareness-raising projects, campaigns, and programs specifically designed to engage men and boys, which will target transforming masculine norms and values. That's why we attach great importance to awareness-raising projects and campaigns through direct and indirect means. As a growing organization, Turuncu considers that it's best to engage in local campaigns and cooperate with other NGOs while seeking to expand the scope of its reach and operations. We have been involved in some projects related with gender equality and more projects to come. Eventually, a fresh news is that our current project proposal named Building Rainbow Bridges, Establishing Psychosocial and Legal Support Networks for LGBTQI in provincial districts of Izmir has been accepted by the US Embassy. With this project, we will provide accessible qualified support by training social workers, psychologists, and lawyers on gender equality and LGBTQI rights. Additionally, a judiciary guidebook concisely relying on contemporary laws and issues pertaining to trans people will be produced publicly. Our entire struggle is contributing to the efforts to make the world a better place under the protective umbrella of equality. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your presentation. I think Amanda has a question, and then I have a comment afterwards, and we can go for more questions.
Ezgi, thank you so much for that. That was so informative, and the work that you're doing is just so important, and I'm happy that you are with us today. So here in the United States, over the last few weeks, we've been seeing a lot of bills being introduced in states that are harmful for trans folks, for people in the LGBTQI plus community. So I was just wondering in Turkey if you are, what kind of themes or what kind of, legislation-wise, if you are seeing similar trends in kind of these backward steps in supportive legislation for the community.
You mean legislate for the pertaining to the LGBTQI plus? No, we don't have legislation particular for them, but we try to based on our works on the human rights. So actually the public authorities and the society still ignore their existence. So we have a long way to go to form a legislation for them. So what we're trying to do is we by little, as Laura say, with many small dosages, we are trying to give the sense that, come on, I mean, they exist and they are here. So we have to recognize their rights, and we cannot ignore them. And I didn't want to mention about this research because I have very limited time, but in this research, most of the people didn't want to neighbor them. But these people who said no don't have any relative, any friends of LGBTIQ. Once they know it, the percentage of saying no changes. So we should know, we should, recognize, and we should do something for them. Right? For legislation, we have a lot way to go.
Thank you so much. I really admire the work that you're doing in Turkey, and it's work that needs to be done everywhere. I think we are coming to the end of our program, but I just wanted to mention something that was discovered, an absolutely wonderful invention, the artificial heart. I think that probably happened long before most of you were born. But when they had this wonderful thing that could save lives, an artificial heart, put it in people, they found that it worked very well in men and it didn't work in women. And the reason it didn't work in women was the artificial heart was invented by men for men, and it was the right size for men. It wasn't the right size for women. And the way to solve those kinds of problems is if you have women as part of your development, as part of the strategy to organize your company, to organize whatever it is you're doing, you're going to have better decisions. And that goes to all kinds of diversity. If you have a diverse workforce, a diverse board of directors, a diverse legislature of all ethnicities, of all backgrounds, all sexual orientations, gender identities, the larger and more diverse that group is, the better the decisions will be, the more sustainable they'll be. You won't have these situations where it works for one gender and it doesn't work for another gender if you have that kind of diversity in how you work. This has been a wonderful presentation. I don't know if there are any burning questions. I don't see any in the chat, but I really want to thank our speakers. Unfortunately, Dr. Quiros had to leave early, so she's gone, but I want to thank Sameena, Azhar, and Ezgi, Yılmaz, especially from coming all the way from Turkey for this, but absolutely fabulous presentations, all of them. And this will be recorded, or has been recorded, and it will be sent to everybody. I'm sure these are messages I'm going to want to listen to them again and again because they were so full and important and impactful. And I know everybody else will want to do that as well. So thank you so much. And let's stay in touch and see if there are ways that we can collaborate and do work together. And I think somebody else is going to actually officially close us out. Who is that?
Of our speakers.
Sameena
who
has a
have-
question.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah. No, not so much a question. I think just more of a comment. I mean, a little bit in response to Amanda, what you had just posed to Ezgi. So Ezgi, unfortunately, this legislation is actually quite oppressive because it's barring typically trans youth from being able to access gender affirming medical care. So it's a good thing you don't have it happening in Turkey right now. But just to say that I think in the US in particular, this is such a poignant moment for issues impacting LGBTQI communities. We're feeling the pressures or the tensions, I think, on multiple levels, right? So there's that legislation. There's other legislation in Texas barring queer or gender non-conforming or lesbian or gay parents from being able to adopt. So restrictions on foster care and things. It's becoming increasingly difficult to get funding for queer research, right? So I think on multiple levels, there's this tension that is often associated with the conservative right or the religious right, definitely the case also in Pakistan. I've got some very hateful messages from people who are quite upset at me for doing the work that I do. So just to say that it's such an important time, I think, to be engaged in this, and I'm happy that so many people are interested in this from all over the world, because yeah, it's under attack, to put it bluntly. That's all. That's my soapbox for today.
I appreciate that, Sameena. Thank you.
Yeah, I do as well. I think we have this conception that we're evolving and getting better all the time, and we're not. We're seeing backlash against women, against queer people, against trans people, against Black people. And so we are not moving forward in a lot of ways. A lot of ways we're moving backwards. And so we've got to, those of us that would like to push forward to a better, more inclusive and diverse world have our work cut out for us.
Which is why your organization, Ezgi, and also your research, Sameena, are just so important. And I'm glad that you're bringing awareness. And I hope that we can help share your messages with our network. So thank you again for being here.
All right, Rose, take us out.
Well, I'd like to say again, thank you so much to all of our speakers who've taken time out of their busy schedules to be part of our event today, especially at 8 a.m. in the morning. Very much appreciated. All of the speakers have provided important context to the topic, and we've definitely benefited from your expertise. We will be sending out a recording of this webinar to all of the registered participants. And for further event information, please follow us on Instagram at UUOfficeUN, which I will be dropping in the chat box right now. So once again, thank you everyone, panelists, attendees, the UUA staff for being with us today.